Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight's story takes us to the quiet countryside of Central Florida, where beneath a backyard fire pit and concrete slab lay a secret that would take years to uncover. This is the story of Michael Shaver, a young father who vanished one November weekend, and the web of deception that followed his disappearance. In the rolling hills of upstate New York, two teenagers met and fell in love the way young people often do. Quickly, intensely, with the kind of certainty that feels like it will last forever. Michael Shaver and Lori were high school sweethearts, their romance beginning in the familiar halls of Lawrence Central School. Michael was the kind of person people remembered, friendly, hard-working, with an easy smile and a knack for fixing things. Lori was drawn to him, and soon their lives became intertwined in that way that feels inevitable when you're young. Like many young couples from rural New York, they dreamed of something different, somewhere warmer, a place where opportunities might bloom like the orange trees that dotted the landscape. So they made a plan, packed their lives into boxes, and headed south to Florida, where the sun shone year-round and the promise of a fresh start beckoned. They settled in Claremont, a small city in Lake County about half an hour west of Orlando. It wasn't a glamorous place, but it was theirs. Michael found work as a technician, using his natural ability with machines and equipment to make a living. He was good at what he did. Reliable, the kind of employee who showed up on time and got the job done without complaints. Lori stayed home with their children. They had two kids together, including a daughter named Isabel, who would grow up on their rural property. The property itself was something special. 5 acres of Florida land on Sandy Pines Road, with enough space to breathe, to build, to imagine a future. It was quiet out there, the kind of place where you could hear the cicadas singing in the evening and watch the sun set over your own land without the intrusion of close neighbors. Michael loved that property. He invested his time and money into it, building and improving, creating a home for his family. But somewhere along the way, the fairy tale began to crack. By 2015, the marriage between Michael and Lori Shaver had deteriorated in that slow, grinding way that marriages sometimes do. They were still living under the same roof, still technically together, but the romance had long since faded. In fact, they had reached an arrangement that might seem unusual to some. They were living together but seeing other people. Lori had become involved with someone else, a man named Travis Filmer. The relationship had grown serious. Serious enough that people in their circle knew about it. Michael, too, had begun dating someone, trying to move forward with his life, even as he remained tethered to the property and the family he built with Lori. It was a strange situation, this limbo they found themselves in. Neither fully together, nor completely apart. They existed in a kind of domestic purgatory. The tension was palpable, especially to those who knew them well. November 7, 2015 was a Saturday, the kind of mild Florida autumn day that brings people outdoors. Michael had plans to attend a local tractor show, a kind of community event that drew folks from all over Lake County. These shows were popular in rural Florida, where farming equipment and machinery held both practical value and nostalgic appeal. Michael brought his family along, and a coworker named Frank Merritt joined them for the day. Frank Merritt would later remember that day with unsettling clarity. He noticed the tension between Michael and Lori, the way they moved around each other with careful distance, the looks that passed between them that spoke of unresolved conflict. It wasn't the comfortable silence of a long marriage, but something darker, more fraught. Still, Merritt thought little of it at the time. Couples fight, marriages have their rough patches. He figured they'd work it out. The weekend passed. Sunday came and went. Then Monday arrived and Michael Shaver didn't show up for work. Frank Merritt checked his phone Monday morning, expecting perhaps a message from Michael about running late or taking a sick day. Nothing came. Tuesday arrived with the same silence. By Wednesday, with 3 consecutive no-shows, Merritt reached out. concerned about his reliable coworker's uncharacteristic absence. Finally, a response came, but not from Michael directly. It was a text message claiming to be from Michael, explaining that he was quitting his job. The reason given was vague. He needed to save his marriage. The phrasing was odd, the timing stranger still, but what could Merritt do? People quit jobs. People make sudden decisions to prioritize their relationships. Still, something about it didn't sit right. As days turned to weeks and weeks turned to months, Michael Shaver's absence became increasingly conspicuous to those who knew him. Friends tried to reach out. Family members attempted to make contact. But Michael seemed to have simply vanished from his own life. What made his disappearance even more peculiar was that he appeared to still exist online. His Facebook account remained active, posting updates, interacting with the digital world. But something was off about these posts. Friends and family who knew Michael well noticed the inconsistencies. The tone wasn't quite right, the content seemed strange, and perhaps most tellingly, photographs had been systematically removed from his profile. Eventually, someone, perhaps a friend, perhaps a family member, decided to look more closely at Lori's situation. What they found was concerning. When visiting the property on Sandy Pines Road, they discovered Michael's personal belongings still there. His wallet, his phone, the things a person doesn't leave behind when they voluntarily walk away from their life. These were the possessions that anchor us to our identity, the practical necessities of modern existence. You might leave behind furniture or books or old clothes, but your wallet, your phone, these items suggested something far more sinister than a man choosing to leave his family to start fresh somewhere else. Yet still, no official missing persons report was filed. Time continued to pass, and with each passing month, the trail grew colder. By early 2018, more than 2 years had passed since anyone had verifiably seen or spoken to Michael Shaver. The concern among friends had grown, the whispers had gotten louder, and finally, someone reached out to law enforcement with their suspicions. The Lake County Sheriff's Office began looking into the case, and as they started asking questions, the inconsistencies in Lori's story became harder to ignore. She maintained that Michael had left, that he'd abandoned the family, that he was alive somewhere living his own life. But the evidence suggested otherwise. In March 2018, investigators made the decision to search the property on Sandy Pines Road. 5 acres is a lot of ground to cover, and they weren't entirely sure what they were looking for or where they might find it. But they had their suspicions, and those suspicions led them to the backyard. There, in what should have been an ordinary piece of Florida landscape, they found something unusual. A fire pit sat atop a large concrete slab, the kind of outdoor feature that might be used for family gatherings or evening relaxation. But this particular fire pit had been built recently, sometime after Michael's disappearance, and the concrete beneath it looked newer than it should have been. The investigators began to dig. Beneath the concrete slab, wrapped in a sheet, they found human remains. The skeleton was incomplete, bones scattered and disturbed, but there was enough to work with. The skull showed evidence of a single gunshot wound to the back of the head, an execution-style killing. DNA testing would eventually confirm what investigators already suspected. These were the remains of Michael Shaver. He hadn't left his family. He hadn't started a new life somewhere else. He had been dead all along, buried in his own backyard. The earth he had once loved and tended, becoming his unmarked grave. The irony was almost cruel. That fire pit, that concrete slab, it was the very spot where Lori had married Travis Filmer, her new husband, a little over a year after Michael's death. They had literally stood above his body to exchange their vows, to celebrate their new beginning, while Michael lay beneath their feet. The discovery of Michael's remains changed everything. What had been a missing persons case became a homicide investigation, and all eyes turned to Lori Shaver. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. She had been the only adult living on the property at the time of Michael's disappearance. She had access to his phone and social media accounts, which explained the posts that had continued after his death. She had sold off his expensive tools and guns, liquidating his assets piece by piece. She had moved on with her life remarkably quickly for someone whose husband had supposedly abandoned the family. And then there was the matter of the fire pit and concrete slab, constructed over the exact spot where Michael's body had been buried. In February 2020, nearly 5 years after Michael's death, Lori Shaver was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. She was 38 years old at the time of her arrest, a woman who had spent years living with the secret of what had happened that November weekend in 2015. The case drew immediate attention. There was something particularly chilling about a murder in a domestic setting, about a body buried in a backyard, about a wife who had allegedly killed her husband and then gone on with her life, marrying someone new, raising her children, all while maintaining the fiction that Michael had simply left. Lori maintained her innocence, but the prosecution began building their case, piecing together the timeline, gathering evidence, preparing to prove that she had killed Michael Shaver and then engaged in an elaborate cover-up. The American justice system moves slowly, and Lori's case would be no exception. After her arrest in 2020, there were hearings and motions, legal maneuvering and delays. At one point, a judge granted her bond, allowing her to await trial outside of jail, a decision that troubled many who were watching the case. The COVID-19 pandemic further complicated matters, as courts across the country slowed their proceedings to protect public health. Cases that might have gone to trial in months instead stretched into years. During this time, Lori's children continued to grow up. Isabel, who had been just 7 years old when her father disappeared, was now a teenager. She had spent her formative years without her father, living with the knowledge that he was buried in the backyard, that her mother was accused of killing him. Michael's family waited too, frustrated by the delays, desperate for justice, unable to fully grieve or move forward while the legal process ground on at its inexorable pace. His brother Brian would later speak about the pain of those years, the wound that wouldn't heal, the loss that colored everything. Finally, in September 2024, nearly a decade after Michael's death, the case went to trial. The courtroom in Lake County was packed as the trial began. This was a case that had captured local attention, and now the community would finally hear the full story of what had happened to Michael Shaver. The prosecution laid out their case methodically. They presented evidence that Michael had been killed sometime between November 7 and November 10, 2015. Right after that tractor show where witnesses had noticed the tension between the couple, they showed that no one had seen or verifiably spoken to Michael after that weekend. They demonstrated that his social media activity after his death had been fabricated, his accounts managed by someone who wasn't him. They brought forward Frank Merritt, Michael's coworker, who testified about the unusual text message, claiming Michael was quitting to save his marriage. They showed how Lori had systematically disposed of Michael's property, selling his valuable tools and firearms. They presented evidence that she was the only adult at the property when Michael was killed, that she had the means and the opportunity, and perhaps most importantly, that she had constructed the fire pit and concrete slab over his burial site. The medical examiner testified about the gunshot wound to the back of Michael's head, describing how the trajectory and placement suggested he had been shot while unaware, possibly while sitting or kneeling. It was a killing shot, precise and final, but the defense had a shocking strategy. On one of the final days of the trial, the courtroom fell silent as a 15-year-old girl took the witness stand. Isabel Shaver, now a teenager, had been just 7 years old when her father died. And according to the defense's stunning claim, she was the one who had pulled the trigger. Isabel's testimony was emotional and detailed. She described a household filled with tension and violence, painting a picture of Michael as an abusive father and husband. According to her account, on that November day in 2015, she had witnessed her father attacking her mother. In fear for Lori's life, 7-year-old Isabel had grabbed a gun, a weapon that should never have been accessible to a child, and shot her father in the back of the head. The defense presented this as a case of a child trying to protect her mother, followed by a panicked cover-up. Lori had testified in her own defense as well, supporting her daughter's version of events and describing years of alleged abuse at Michael's hands. She claimed that the relationship had been troubled from the beginning, that Michael had been angry about her pregnancy, that violence had been a constant presence in their home. But the prosecution wasn't buying it. They pointed out multiple inconsistencies in Isabel's story, noting that her account had changed several times over the years. They questioned how a 7-year-old child could have had the physical strength and coordination to shoot an adult man in the back of the head with such precision. They noted that Isabel had initially implicated another person, a family friend, in the shooting. But when that person took the stand, he denied ever meeting Michael, let alone participating in his murder. Most damaging to the defense's case was the forensic evidence. The autopsy had determined that Michael had been shot in the back of the head from behind, in a position that suggested he was unaware of the threat. The angle of the wound, the trajectory of the bullet, the circumstances of the burial, All of these factors painted a picture not of a child's panicked act of protection, but of a calculated killing. The prosecution argued that Lori had coached her daughter to take the fall for a murder she herself had committed. It was a desperate gambit, they said. An attempt to use her own child as a shield against justice. After all, a 7-year-old who shot someone in defense of a parent would likely face little to no legal consequences, especially if the shooting could be framed as an accident or an act of protection during domestic violence. But Isabel had been 7 years old at the time of the killing, too young to be charged as an adult, too young to face serious legal consequences. The defense seemed to be banking on the jury's sympathy for a child caught in a terrible situation, hoping they would believe that the real tragedy here was a family torn apart by violence, with Lori doing her best to protect her children in the aftermath. After closing arguments, the jury retired to deliberate. They had heard days of testimony, seen photographs of Michael's remains, listened to expert witnesses explain the forensic evidence. Now they had to decide, was Lori Shaver a murderer who had killed her husband and spent years covering up the crime? Or was she a victim of circumstance, trying to protect her daughter who had acted in a moment of terror? It took them approximately 4 hours to reach their decision. When the jury returned to the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Family members of Michael Shaver sat on one side, hoping for justice. Lori's supporters sat on another, hoping for acquittal or at least understanding. The verdict was read, guilty of second-degree murder. Lori Shaver became visibly distraught as the words were spoken. She turned away from the jury, her shoulders shaking. Whatever she had expected, whatever hope she had held on to, it crumbled in that moment. The jury had rejected the defense's narrative. They didn't believe that 7-year-old Isabel had killed her father. They believed that Lori had pulled the trigger, had buried her husband in the backyard, had built a fire pit over his grave, had married another man on the spot where Michael lay, and had spent years maintaining the fiction that he had simply walked away. But the conviction was for second-degree murder, not first-degree. This distinction is important in Florida law. First-degree murder requires premeditation proof that the killing was planned in advance. Second-degree murder can be a killing done in the heat of the moment, without prior planning, but still with malicious intent. The jury's verdict suggested they believed Lori had killed Michael, but perhaps not that she had planned it days or weeks in advance. Maybe it was an argument that escalated. Maybe it was a moment of rage, but regardless of the planning or lack thereof, they believed she had killed him and then deliberately covered up the crime. Sentencing came in November 2024, more than 2 months after the guilty verdict. These intervening weeks had allowed time for victim impact statements to be prepared, for the defense to make arguments for leniency, and for Judge Carrie F. Rada to consider the appropriate punishment. When Lori appeared in court for sentencing, she heard from Michael's family, people who had spent nearly a decade waiting for this moment. Brian Shaver, Michael's brother, spoke about the pain of losing his sibling, about the years of not knowing what had happened, about the wound that would never fully heal. The loss of Michael is a wound that will never fully heal, Brian told the court, his voice carrying the weight of years of grief and frustration. The defense made their arguments for a lesser sentence, perhaps hoping that the jury's decision to convict on second-degree rather than first-degree murder indicated some sympathy for Lori's situation. But Judge Rada had heard the evidence, had seen the photos of Michael's remains, had considered the years of deception that followed his death. The sentence was life in prison. Florida law gives judges some discretion in sentencing for second-degree murder, but this was a case where the circumstances called for the harshest available punishment. The premeditated cover-up, the years of lies, the use of Michael's own property as his grave. These factors weighed heavily. Lori was 41 years old at sentencing. Barring any successful appeals, she would spend the rest of her life behind bars for the murder of the man she had once loved enough to leave New York with, the father of her children, the high school sweetheart who had become her victim. She had 30 days to file an appeal, and whether she would do so remained to be seen. But for now, the case of Michael Shaver was closed. As with many true crime cases, the conviction and sentencing don't answer every question. There are things we'll likely never know for certain about what happened on that November weekend in 2015. What exactly triggered the fatal confrontation between Michael and Lori? Was it an argument about their failing marriage, about the other people they were seeing, about the property they both had claim to? Or was it something else entirely, some final straw in a relationship that had been fraying for years? And what about the children? Isabel was 7 when her father died. Old enough to remember him, old enough to have been impacted by whatever she witnessed or experienced. The defense's claim that she pulled the trigger, whether true or a desperate legal strategy, meant that this teenage girl had to testify in open court about the worst day of her life. She had to face the public scrutiny of her testimony being dissected and disbelieved. Regardless of what actually happened, that child has been traumatized in ways most of us can barely imagine. What about Travis Filmer, the man Lori married on the very spot where Michael was buried? What did he know, and when did he know it? The trial revealed little about his role, if any, in the cover-up. But one has to wonder about the psychology of someone who would marry under those circumstances. And Michael himself, what were his last moments like? Did he know what was about to happen? Did he feel the betrayal before he felt the bullet? Or was it mercifully quick, a surprise he never saw coming? These questions linger, unresolved, and perhaps unresolvable. The jury heard the evidence and rendered their verdict. The judge passed sentence. The legal system did what it was designed to do. But the human story, the emotional truth of what happened in that house on Sandy Pines Road, remains partially obscured. All we know for certain is that Michael Shaver went to a tractor show with his family one November Saturday in 2015, and he never came home. His body lay beneath the Florida soil for more than 2 years before anyone thought to look for it there. His children grew up without him. His family mourned not knowing, and his wife moved on, building a new life, literally on top of his grave. In the end, justice came for Michael Shaver, though it came slowly. His killer was convicted and sentenced. His remains were finally laid to rest properly. His name, which had been reduced to a Facebook profile managed by an imposter, was restored to him. But justice, however important, can never undo what was done. It can never give Michael back the years he lost, can never restore him to his family, can never let him watch his children grow up. Justice is cold comfort to those left behind, a necessary but insufficient response to irreversible loss. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, perhaps spare a thought for Michael Shaver, for the life he lived and the life he should have had. Think about the fragility of trust, the ways relationships can sour and turn toxic, the thin line between love and violence that some couples walk without ever meaning to. And remember that beneath many ordinary places, backyards and basements, fields and forests, lie secrets that took years to uncover. Michael's story emerged only because someone finally asked the right questions, because investigators finally looked in the right place. How many other stories remain hidden, waiting for someone to start digging? Tomorrow brings new stories, new mysteries, new crimes to examine and puzzle over. But this story belongs to Michael Shaver and the justice that came too late, but came nonetheless. If this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Mr. Sleepy Crime, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight we're traveling back to the 1950s to a small farming community in central Wisconsin where the streets were quiet, the neighbors were friendly, and everyone knew everyone else's name. This is Plainfield, a town where nothing much ever happened. Until November 16, 1957, when the discovery of what lay inside one dilapidated farmhouse would forever change how America understood the darkness that could lurk behind the most ordinary of faces. This is the story of Ed Gein, a man whose crimes were so disturbing, so unprecedented, that they would inspire some of the most iconic horror films ever made. But this isn't fiction. This is real. And it happened in a place just like any other. Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse, Wisconsin. From the very beginning, his life was defined by isolation and the overwhelming presence of one person, his mother, Augusta Wilhelmine Gein. Augusta was a formidable woman, deeply religious and fiercely controlling. She believed the world was a cesspool of sin, particularly when it came to women, whom she viewed as instruments of temptation and corruption. She preached constantly to her two sons, Ed and his older brother Henry, about the evils of lust, the wickedness of alcohol, and the necessity of purity. In her eyes, nearly everyone outside their family was contaminated by immorality. Ed's father, George Gain, was a tanner and carpenter, but he was also an alcoholic who spent most of his days in a drunken stupor. He was weak in Augusta's eyes, a failure, and she made sure her sons knew it. George had no power in that household. Augusta ruled with an iron fist and a tongue sharp enough to cut through any defiance. In 1914, when Ed was just 8 years old, Augusta moved the family to a 19-acre farm outside Plainfield. The location was deliberate. She wanted her sons away from the corrupting influence of the city, away from other children who might lead them astray, away from women who might tempt them. The farmhouse became their prison, and Augusta was both guard and judge. Ed was a sensitive child, small for his age, with a slightly lazy eye that made him the target of bullying at school. He was an average student, shy and awkward, struggling to connect with other children. Not that Augusta encouraged friendships. She actively discouraged her sons from forming bonds with anyone outside the family. Other children were dirty, sinful, dangerous, but Ed worshipped his mother. Despite her harsh treatment, despite her constant criticism and control, he loved her with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She was the center of his universe, the only person who mattered. She told him what to think, what to believe, how to behave, and he obeyed without question. Henry, Ed's older brother, was different. As he grew into adolescence, Henry began to question their mother's teachings. He started to see Augusta for what she was, a domineering, emotionally abusive woman who was suffocating them. He would sometimes criticize her in front of Ed, pointing out her hypocrisy and her cruelty. Ed couldn't stand it. To hear anyone speak badly of his mother was unbearable. On May 16, 1944, something happened that would haunt the Giant family forever. Ed and Henry were burning marsh vegetation on their property when the fire got out of control. In the chaos, the brothers became separated. When Ed returned home without Henry, he told police he didn't know where his brother was. Yet when the search party went out, Ed led them directly to Henry's body, lying face down in an area of the marsh that the fire hadn't even touched. Henry was dead. The official cause was listed as asphyxiation from smoke inhalation, but there were bruises on his head that were never fully explained. No autopsy was performed. No serious investigation was launched. It was ruled an accident, and the case was closed. Some believe Ed killed his brother that day. Others think Henry's death was truly accidental. We'll never know for certain. But what is certain is that Henry's death left Ed alone with his mother, which is exactly where he wanted to be. George Gain died of heart failure in 1940, but his passing barely registered in the household. He'd been a ghost for years anyway, a shadow of a man drifting through the farmhouse in an alcoholic haze. His death changed nothing for Ed and Augusta, but when Augusta suffered her first stroke in 1944, everything began to unravel. Ed became her full-time caretaker, attending to her every need with devotion. He cooked for her, cleaned for her, dressed her. She was completely dependent on him. And for Ed, this was perhaps the happiest period of his life. He had his mother all to himself, and she needed him. Then, in December 1945, Augusta suffered a second, more severe stroke. This time, she didn't recover. She died, and Ed's world collapsed. At 39 years old, Ed Gain was suddenly alone for the first time in his life. The woman who had defined his existence, who had filled every corner of his mind, was gone. The farmhouse, once cramped with her presence, now echoed with emptiness. He sealed off the rooms his mother had used most often. Her bedroom, the upstairs, the parlor. These spaces became shrines, left exactly as they had been the day she died. He moved his living space to a small area near the kitchen, and the rest of the house fell into decay. Garbage piled up, dust accumulated. The farm descended into squalor. Ed took odd jobs around Plainfield. Working as a handyman, the townspeople found him strange but harmless. He was polite, soft-spoken, reliable enough when it came to small repairs. He'd babysit for local families sometimes, and the children seemed to like him well enough, though parents noticed he had an odd habit of talking about death and anatomy. But this was rural Wisconsin in the late 1940s. People were eccentric, Ed was just another local character. What no one knew was what Ed was doing in the dark hours, when Plainfield slept and the graveyards lay silent under the stars. Between 1947 and 1952, Ed Jan became a regular visitor to three local cemeteries: Plainfield Cemetery, Hancock Cemetery, and Spiritland Cemetery. He developed a routine. He'd read obituaries in the local newspaper, paying particular attention to middle-aged women who had recently been buried, women who in some way resembled his mother. Then, on nights when the moon was bright enough to work by but the streets were empty, he'd take his truck to the cemetery. He'd dig quietly, methodically. He'd exhume the recently buried bodies. Sometimes he'd take the entire corpse. Other times he'd take only certain parts, the head perhaps, or sections of skin. He'd carefully refill the grave, remove any evidence of his presence, and drive home with his cargo. Later he would claim he was in a daze during these expeditions, that he couldn't fully remember doing them. He said it was like sleepwalking, as if someone else was moving his body while his mind floated somewhere far away. Whether this was true or simply a convenient excuse, we'll never know. But the grave robbing continued for at least 5 years, and he was never caught in the act. What did he do with these bodies? That question would be answered in the most horrifying way imaginable. Ed had become fascinated with anatomy books and pulp magazines about exotic rituals and headhunting tribes. He read about Nazi war criminals and their experiments, his mind already warped by a lifetime of his mother's psychological abuse and his own inability to process her death. Twisted these influences into something dark and unfathomable. He began to create things. Objects, keepsakes, using the bodies he'd exhumed and the tanning skills his father had possessed. Ed transformed human remains into everyday items. He fashioned bowls from skulls. He upholstered chairs with human skin. He crafted lampshades and wastebaskets from tanned flesh. He made a belt decorated with human nipples. He preserved faces like masks, including the face of Mary Hogan, though no one would discover that connection for years. And he created something else, something even more disturbing. A full bodysuit made from the skin of women. He would wear this suit and dance around the farmhouse by candlelight, pretending to be his mother, trying to literally crawl inside the skin of the woman he'd lost. Ed Jan wasn't creating horror for horror's sake. In his fractured mind, he was trying to resurrect his mother, trying to become her, trying to fill the void her death had left. The psychology behind his actions is complex and deeply disturbing, rooted in extreme maternal enmeshment, unresolved grief, and quite possibly gender identity confusion that he had no framework to understand or express in the repressive 1950s. But the grave robbing was about to escalate into something worse. On December 8, 1954, Mary Hogan disappeared from her tavern in Pine Grove, a small community about 6 miles from Plainfield. Mary was 51 years old, heavy-set, with a personality as large as her frame. She ran a tavern that had a certain reputation. It was the kind of place respectable folks didn't frequent, if you know what I mean. When customers arrived that afternoon, they found the tavern empty, the lights still on, the register open. There was blood on the floor, a significant amount, and what appeared to be a drag mark leading toward the back door. A .22 caliber shell casing was found on the floor. Mary Hogan was gone. The police investigated but came up empty. There were no witnesses, no clear motive, no obvious suspects. The case went cold. Mary Hogan became another missing person, her fate unknown. People speculated maybe she'd run off with a customer. Maybe she'd gotten mixed up with the wrong people. Maybe she'd simply decided to disappear and start over somewhere else. But Mary Hogan hadn't run away. She was much closer than anyone realized. She was at the Gianni farm, or at least parts of her were. Ed had shot her with his brother's old pistol. Later, he would claim he didn't fully remember doing it, that it happened in one of his trances. He said Mary reminded him of his mother. He brought her body back to his farm and added her remains to his collection. Her face became one of his masks. Her head would eventually be found in a paper bag at the farmhouse. But that discovery was still 3 years away. After Mary Hogan's disappearance, life in Plainfield continued as normal. Ed kept doing odd jobs, kept to himself, kept his secrets. People might have noticed that he'd occasionally make unsettling jokes. Once, when a customer at the local store joked about Mary Hogan's disappearance, Ed reportedly grinned and said, "She isn't missing. She's at the farm right now." Everyone laughed. It was just Ed being weird. 3 years passed. November 16th, 1957, started as an ordinary Saturday in Plainfield. Bernice Worden opened her hardware store as usual. She was 58 years old, a widow who'd been running the store since her husband's death. She was well liked in the community, known for her no-nonsense attitude and her kindness to customers. Her son, Frank Worden, was the deputy sheriff. That morning, Frank stopped by the store before heading out to go deer hunting. It was opening day of deer season, and most of the men in Plainfield would be in the woods. The town would be quiet. Bernice told her son she expected to have few customers that day, maybe just one or two. She mentioned that Ed Jane had been in the day before, saying he needed to buy antifreeze and would return Saturday to pick it up. Frank nodded, kissed his mother goodbye, and left for his hunting trip. That was the last time he would see her alive. Around 9:30 that morning, a neighbor saw Bernice's pickup truck driving away from the rear of the hardware store. The truck disappeared down the road. The store remained dark and closed for the rest of the day, which was unusual. Bernice was nothing if not reliable. When Frank returned from hunting that evening and found the store locked, the lights off, and his mother gone, he knew immediately something was wrong. The front door was locked, but the back door was open. Inside, the store was empty. The cash register was open, and the last receipt still sat in it. It was for a half-gallon of antifreeze. The receipt was dated that morning, and the customer's name on the store ledger in Bernice's handwriting was Ed Gain. There were bloodstains on the floor. Frank immediately called the sheriff. Within hours, law enforcement officers descended on Plainfield, and their attention quickly turned to the dilapidated Jane farm on the outskirts of town. When Sheriff Archley and Captain Lloyd Schoferster arrived at the Gan farm that evening, they noticed Ed wasn't home. His truck was gone. They decided to search the property anyway, starting with the outbuildings. They approached a summer kitchen, a shed attached to the main house that Ed used for storage. Captain Schoferster shined his flashlight through the door and into the darkness. What he saw made him stagger backward. Hanging from the rafters, suspended by ropes tied around the ankles, was the decapitated, gutted corpse of a woman. The body had been dressed out like a deer, split open from neck to groin. Bernice Worden had been found. But this was only the beginning. As more officers arrived and they began to search the main farmhouse, the full scope of Ed Jine's crimes came to light. What they found inside that house would haunt the investigators for the rest of their lives. Hardened police officers walked out of that building and vomited in the yard. Some had nightmares for years afterward. One officer reportedly required psychiatric treatment. Let me describe what they found, though the full inventory is almost beyond belief. The house itself was in a state of extreme decay. Garbage and debris covered every surface. The smell was overwhelming. Rot, mildew, decay, and death. Mountains of old newspapers and magazines created narrow pathways through the rooms. Only the kitchen area seemed remotely livable. But it was what lay among the garbage that made this place a house of horrors. They found Bernice Worden's head in a burlap sack. Her heart was on the stove in a cooking pot. In the refrigerator were human organs preserved in mason jars. They found 4 noses in a cup, 9 masks made from human faces, including the face of Mary Hogan, peeled from the skulls and preserved like leather. Some of these faces still had hair attached. They found a shoebox containing 9 vulvas, carefully preserved, a belt made from human nipples, bracelets made from human skin, a sheath for a hunting knife, fashioned from human flesh, leggings made from human leg skin, 4 chairs with seats upholstered in human skin. They found bowls made from the tops of human skulls, a lampshade covered in human skin, bones used as bedposts, a wastebasket made from human skin, skulls mounted on bedposts, like decorative knobs. They found the full woman's suit, a vest and leggings made from tanned human skin, complete with breasts and a vagina that Ed could wear to transform himself into a woman and to his mother. In the kitchen, they found a refrigerator handle fashioned from human skin. Lips hung from strings like Christmas ornaments. A table with human skin stretched over the top. They found fingernails pulled from corpses, stored in a box, teeth in jars, fragments of bone carved into utensils. And through all of this horror, One area remained untouched. Augusta Jean's bedroom. Upstairs, sealed off and preserved exactly as it had been the day she died 12 years earlier. The bed was made. Her clothes hung in the closet. Dust covered everything like a shroud, but nothing had been moved. Nothing had been disturbed. It was a shrine to the woman who had created the monster living below. Later, when investigators excavated the property, they found more remains buried around the farm. In total, they estimated that Ed Gein had violated at least 15 graves and murdered at least 2 women, possibly more. Ed Gein was arrested that night at a neighbor's house, where he'd gone to buy groceries. When police took him into custody, he seemed almost relieved. He was calm, cooperative, almost childlike in his demeanor. He confessed to killing Bernice Worden almost immediately. Yes, he'd gone to the hardware store that morning. Yes, he'd purchased antifreeze. And then he said something came over him. He had his brother's G2 pistol with him. He shot Bernice in the head, dragged her body to her own truck, drove her back to his farm and hung her in the shed. It happened so fast, he said, like he wasn't really in control of his own actions. He also confessed to killing Mary Hogan 3 years earlier, describing a similar scenario, an impulse, a trance-like state, a gunshot, and then the body coming home with him. When asked about the grave robbing, Ed admitted to it freely. He described his nighttime expeditions to the cemeteries, though he insisted he could barely remember them. It was like someone else was doing it, he said. He was just watching from somewhere far away. As for the items made from human remains, Ed showed no real understanding of how horrifying his actions were. He spoke about his creations matter-of-factly, as if he'd been working with leather and wood rather than the skin and bones of human beings. He explained that he'd been trying to create a woman's body, trying to become a woman, trying to be close to his mother again. In his fractured logic, this all made perfect sense. The psychiatrists who examined Ed Gein diagnosed him with severe psychosis. They found him to be deeply disturbed, suffering from what we might now recognize as schizophrenia, with possible elements of what's now called gender dysphoria. Though in the 1950s, the psychological community had no framework for understanding this. His entire sense of self had been warped by his relationship with his mother. He'd never developed a normal sexual identity, never learned to relate to women as people rather than as symbols or objects. His mother's death had broken something fundamental in his psyche, and what emerged was something monstrous. On November 21st, 1957, Ed Gein was declared unfit to stand trial. He was committed to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane in Walpen, Wisconsin. For a decade, Ed Gein remained in the mental hospital, undergoing treatment and evaluation. The authorities didn't forget about him, but the question remained, would he ever be mentally competent enough to stand trial? In 1968, after 11 years of psychiatric treatment, doctors finally declared Ed competent to face justice. At 61 years old, he was brought to trial for the murder of Bernice Worden. Interestingly, he was never tried for Mary Hogan's murder. Though he'd confessed to it, the case was considered closed by his admission. The trial was brief. Ed pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. His defense attorneys argued that Ed had been psychotic at the time of the murder, unable to distinguish right from wrong, driven by compulsions he couldn't control. The prosecution argued that he knew exactly what he was doing. After all, he'd hidden the body, cleaned up evidence, and tried to establish an alibi. On November 14, 1968, the judge found Ed Gein guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Bernice Worden. But then, in a second ruling, the judge determined that Ed had been insane at the time of the crime. The verdict was guilty, but criminally insane. Ed Gein would spend the rest of his life in psychiatric hospitals, not prison. He was returned to Central State Hospital, where he would remain for the next 16 years. In the years following his conviction, Ed Gein gave several interviews to psychiatrists, journalists, and researchers. These conversations provide a disturbing window into his mind. Ed never seemed to fully grasp the horror of what he'd done. He spoke about his crimes with a strange detachment, as if discussing someone else's actions. He was polite, cooperative, even friendly with hospital staff. He became something of a model patient, helping out with cleaning and odd jobs around the facility. Some staff members found him pleasant to talk to, though always a bit odd. He maintained his devotion to his mother's memory until the end. He never spoke badly of Augusta, never blamed her for what he'd become. In his mind, she was still the righteous, holy woman she'd always claimed to be. He couldn't see or wouldn't see how her abuse had shaped him. When asked about the grave robbing and the items he'd created, Ed would sometimes claim he couldn't remember much about it. Other times he'd describe his actions in detail, but insist he'd been in a trance, that it wasn't really him doing these things. He said he'd wanted to dig up his mother's grave, but couldn't bring himself to do it, so he dug up other women instead. He wanted to be close to her, to touch her, to become her. The bodysuit of human skin, he explained, had been his way of literally trying to inhabit a woman's body. He would wear it and dance around the farmhouse, pretending to be his mother. He thought if he could become a woman, become her, then maybe she wouldn't really be gone. It's a psychology so twisted that it's difficult to comprehend. The extreme maternal enmeshment, the complete lack of normal identity development, the inability to process grief, the possible transgender feelings that had no outlet or understanding in the 1940s and 50s. All of it combined to create someone who solved his psychological pain in the most horrific way imaginable. Ed Gein died on July 26, 1984, in the Mendota Mental Health Institute in Madison, Wisconsin. He was 77 years old. The cause of death was complications from cancer. He was buried in Plainfield Cemetery, not far from his mother's grave, though his headstone has been stolen multiple times over the years by morbid souvenir hunters. The Gein farmhouse didn't last long after his arrest. In March 1958, while Ed was institutionalized, the property was being prepared for a public auction. The community wanted to be rid of the place and its horrors. But on the night before the auction, a fire destroyed the house. Investigators suspected arson, and the general belief was that someone from Plainfield had decided to erase the physical reminder of what had happened there. No one was ever charged. The farm itself has long since been reclaimed by nature. If you visit the site today, you'd never know that one of America's most notorious killers once lived there. But Ed Gein's influence didn't die with him or with his farmhouse. His crimes had an enormous impact on American culture, specifically on the horror genre. Writer Robert Bloch lived just 35 miles from Plainfield when Ed was arrested. The news of what was found in that farmhouse inspired Bloch to write a novel called Psycho in 1959. The character of Norman Bates, a quiet, unassuming man dominated by his mother, who preserves her corpse and dresses in women's clothing, was directly inspired by Ed Gein. Alfred Hitchcock turned Bloch's novel into the iconic 1960 film that revolutionized horror cinema. In 1974, Tobe Hooper created the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, with its character Leatherface, who wears masks made from human skin and decorates his home with human remains. This too was inspired by Ed Gein's crimes. In 1991, The Silence of the Lambs introduced the world to Buffalo Bill, a serial killer who murders women to create a suit from their skin. Sound familiar? The film won 5 Academy Awards and brought Ed Gein's legacy back into the public consciousness. Countless other films, books, and TV shows have drawn from the Gein case. The image of the quiet, unassuming neighbor who turns out to be a monster, that's Ed Gein's legacy. Before him, Hollywood monsters were fantastical creatures. Vampires, werewolves, aliens from outer space. After Ed Gein, the horror genre understood that the real monsters look like ordinary people. They live next door. They smile and wave. And you'd never know what they're hiding until it's too late. As you drift off to sleep tonight, think about Plainfield, Wisconsin, in the 1950s. Think about a small farming community, where everyone knew everyone, where doors were left unlocked, where children played freely in the streets. Think about the quiet man who lived on the farm outside town, the one who did odd jobs and babysat occasionally, the one who seemed harmless if a bit strange. The scariest thing about Ed Gein isn't the gruesome inventory of what was found in his house. That's horrifying enough. The scariest thing is how ordinary he seemed, how he existed in plain sight for years. Even after he'd murdered Mary Hogan, even while he was robbing graves and creating his collection of horrors. People saw him every day. They talked to him. They hired him to do repairs. And no one suspected a thing. Ed Gein's story reminds us that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it wears a friendly face. Sometimes it lives quietly on a farm outside a small town. Sometimes it's the person everyone overlooks. The one nobody pays much attention to. The one who seems too meek and mild to be dangerous. The farmhouse is gone now, burned to ash and overgrown by trees. Ed Gein is long dead, buried in the same cemetery where he once dug up bodies by moonlight. The people of Plainfield have done their best to move on, to let the town be known for something other than its most infamous resident. But the story remains, passed down through the decades, transformed into movies and books, but rooted in a reality that's far more disturbing than any fiction. In the end, Ed Gein was a deeply broken human being, warped by abuse and mental illness, unable to process his emotions in any healthy way. That doesn't excuse what he did, but it does remind us that monsters are made, not born. They emerge from childhoods of pain, from relationships that twist the soul, from minds that fracture under pressure. As you close your eyes tonight, in your own home, in your own bed, safe from the horrors of Plainfield, remember this: Ed Gein seemed harmless too. The monster isn't always the stranger in the dark alley. Sometimes the monster is the quiet neighbor. Please, if you're still awake, drop a candle. I want to see who's still with me. Also, don't forget to tell me where you're listening from, the time in your corner of the world, and maybe share one thing you've learned from tonight's stories. Meanwhile, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. It was a Monday evening in Phoenix, Arizona, January 20th, 2020. The kind of evening where the desert air turns cool after the sun dips below the horizon, and families settle into their routines, in a modest home near 24th Street and Southern Avenue, in a quiet neighborhood where children's laughter usually echoed through the streets. Something unthinkable had occurred. A call came into 911 just after nightfall, a woman's voice shaking, barely coherent. 3 children were dead, she said. 3 small children. When Phoenix police officers arrived at the residence, they prepared themselves for what they might find, but nothing could have truly prepared them for the scene inside that house. On a couch arranged carefully, almost tenderly, lay 3 small bodies. A 3-year-old boy named Zane Henry, his sister 23-month-old Maria Henry, still in diapers, just learning to form her first real sentences, and the baby, 7-month-old Catalaya Rios, who had barely begun to experience life at all. They were positioned as if they were sleeping, nestled together on the cushions. But they weren't sleeping. They would never wake up again. Standing nearby was their mother, Rachel Henry. She was only 22 years old. To understand how this unimaginable tragedy came to pass, we need to go back further than that terrible January evening. We need to understand who Rachel Henry was, where she came from, and the spiral that led to this darkest of moments. Rachel Henry's story doesn't begin in Phoenix. It begins in Oklahoma, in a life that was by all accounts troubled long before it ended in such devastating fashion. She had grown up in circumstances that weren't easy, though the details of her early childhood remain somewhat obscured in the public record. What we do know is that by the time she became a young mother herself, Rachel was already struggling. In Oklahoma, before the move to Arizona, Rachel lived with Pedro Rios, the father of her children. Their relationship was turbulent. Police reports from Oklahoma paint a picture of domestic disturbance, of arguments that escalated, of a young woman caught in a cycle she couldn't seem to escape. Multiple times, local police were called to check on the welfare of the children. Social services became involved. There were safety plans put in place, boundaries drawn by child welfare workers trying to protect those 3 young lives. One of those safety plans specifically barred Rachel from being with the children's father. It was meant to create stability, to remove the chaos from the children's environment. But Rachel didn't comply. How could she? When you're young, when you're struggling, when the person you're supposed to stay away from is also the father of your children, the world doesn't present itself in clean, simple choices. Life becomes a series of impossible decisions, each one leading to the next, each one narrowing the path forward. And there was something else happening too. Something darker. Rachel Henry had developed a methamphetamine addiction. It's a detail that would later come up in court proceedings, mentioned by prosecutors who noted that the children had been taken away from her in the past because of this addiction. Methamphetamine doesn't just alter your mind in the moment. It rewires you, changes the way you think, the way you feel, the way you see the world, and your place in it. For a young mother already struggling with domestic violence, with poverty, with all the weight of trying to raise 3 children, This addiction became another chain, another weight pulling her down. But she loved her children. By all accounts, despite everything else, Rachel Henry loved those three little ones. She sang to them. She held them. In the good moments before everything fell apart completely, she was their mother in all the ways that matter. This is what makes what happened so difficult to comprehend. This is what keeps us up at night, turning these questions over in our minds. In June of 2019, Rachel Henry moved to Phoenix. She packed up what little she had and brought her three children across state lines to Arizona, leaving behind Oklahoma, leaving behind Pedro Rios, leaving behind the police reports and the social services interventions. Perhaps she thought it would be a fresh start. Perhaps she believed that distance would make the difference, that a new city under the desert sun would offer new possibilities. But moving doesn't erase your problems. They travel with you, tucked into your suitcases like unwanted stowaways. In Phoenix, Rachel tried to build a life. She found a place to live in that South Phoenix neighborhood, a home where she could raise her children, but the supports she needed weren't there. Or perhaps they were there, but she couldn't reach them, couldn't access them through the fog of everything else that was wrong. Her defense attorneys would later speak of a lack of support as one of the factors that contributed to what happened. They would speak of her social history, that carefully neutral legal term that encompasses so much pain, so much struggle. And then, in the months after moving to Phoenix, Rachel Henry lost her mother. Grief is a strange thing. It can hollow you out, leave you walking through the world as a shell of yourself. For someone already struggling, already on the edge, the loss of a parent can be the thing that breaks you entirely. Friends and family would later describe noticing a change in Rachel after her mother's death, a decline, a slipping away. She also lost her job. When you're barely keeping your head above water financially, when you have three small children depending on you, losing your job isn't just an inconvenience, it's a crisis. It's the water rising over your head, filling your lungs. There were reports of continued drug use, reports of domestic violence with her boyfriend, a pattern repeating itself in this new city, this place that was supposed to be different. And somewhere in all of this, Rachel Henry became pregnant again, and gave birth to Catalaya, her third child, her second daughter. Postpartum depression, her defense attorney would later say. Among other mental health issues, the weeks and months after giving birth can be treacherous for any mother. But for one already drowning, already struggling with addiction and grief and financial ruin and domestic violence, it can be catastrophic. Friends described watching Rachel Henry unraveling. They saw the signs, the mental decline, the way she was slipping further and further from herself. But knowing someone is struggling and being able to help them are two very different things, especially when that person is caught in the grip of addiction, of mental illness, of circumstances that have piled up so high they've become insurmountable. January 20th, 2020. That Monday evening, Rachel Henry was alone in the house with her three children. Zane, at 3 years old, was probably running around full of the boundless energy that 3-year-olds have. Maria, not quite 2, was likely toddling after her big brother, watching everything he did with those wide eyes children have when they're learning how to be in the world. And baby Catalea, only 7 months old, was at that beautiful age where babies start to really interact, to smile and laugh and reach for their mothers. What happened next is the kind of thing that defies explanation, that resists our understanding. It's the kind of thing that makes us want to look away, to close our eyes, to pretend we didn't hear it. Rachel Henry later confessed to investigators that she smothered her children. One by one, she covered their noses and mouths until they couldn't breathe anymore, until they stopped struggling, until they were still. Reports indicate that she sang to them as she did it. She sang to her babies as she took their lives. It's a detail so heartbreaking, so incomprehensible, that it almost seems unreal. But this is what makes this case so tragic, so disturbing. This wasn't an act of rage. This wasn't violence in a fit of anger. This was something else entirely, something that speaks to a mind that had broken in ways we struggle to understand. When each child was gone, she moved them to the couch. She arranged them carefully, positioned them so they looked like they were sleeping, like they were just taking a nap together, the way children do, as if by making them look peaceful, she could somehow undo what she had done, as if she could create an alternate reality where they were just sleeping, where she could wake them up later, where everything could go back to how it was before. Then Rachel Henry called 911. When the police arrived, body camera footage would later show Rachel's initial statements, Her voice, her demeanor, the things she said, they were sick, she told officers. In those first moments, standing in her home with the bodies of her 3 children nearby, that's what she said. They were sick. But as the officers investigated, as they asked more questions, the truth began to emerge. In the hours after her arrest, Rachel Henry admitted what she had done. She confessed to smothering them, to taking their lives with her own hands. Later, after she'd been taken into custody and was being held in jail, a relative set up a video call with her. Can you imagine that conversation? Can you imagine being on the other end of that call, looking at Rachel Henry's face on a screen, knowing what she'd done? The relative asked her why. Why did you kill the children? Rachel's answer was as chilling as it was tragic. I didn't know what was going on. She didn't know what was going on. In the moment when she took the lives of her 3 children, when she systematically ended each of their precious lives, she wasn't fully present in reality. Something in her mind had fractured so completely that she couldn't even fully grasp what she was doing or why. The legal process that followed was long and complex. Rachel Henry was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. Prosecutors initially indicated they would seek the death penalty. The bond was set at $3 million, an astronomical amount that reflected both the severity of the charges and the fact that Rachel had no real ties to Arizona, having moved there only months before. There was fear that she might flee, might disappear, but Rachel Henry wasn't going anywhere. She sat in jail as the case moved through the system. Initially, she pleaded not guilty. For years, the case wound its way through the courts, delayed by the pandemic, by legal proceedings, by the sheer weight and horror of what had occurred. During this time, psychological evaluations were conducted. Experts examined Rachel's mental state, her history, trying to understand what could lead a mother to do such a thing. The defense team built a case around mental health factors: postpartum depression, addiction, the lack of support systems, the cascade of tragedies that had befallen Rachel in the months leading up to that terrible night. Her defense attorney would emphasize that they might never fully understand what Rachel did, partially because she herself couldn't remember all of it. The human mind, when it breaks, when it experiences trauma or psychosis, or the depths of depression mixed with substance abuse, doesn't always keep clear records. There are blank spaces, moments lost to the fog. But the prosecution didn't see it as a matter of mental health alone. Deputy County Attorney Jennifer Sammons emphasized how the children were completely helpless, how the murders were senseless and cruel. These were babies. They trusted their mother completely. They had no way to defend themselves, no understanding of what was happening to them. In their last moments, they looked to the person who was supposed to protect them above all others, and that person took their lives. In December of 2024, nearly 5 years after that January night, Rachel Henry made a decision. She changed her plea from not guilty to guilty. She stood before a judge and took responsibility for what she had done. She pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder and dangerous crimes against children. As part of the plea agreement, the death penalty was taken off the table. Rachel Henry would not face execution by the state of Arizona. Instead, she would spend the rest of her natural life in prison, with no possibility of parole. On February 14, 2025, Rachel Henry appeared in court for sentencing. She was now 27 years old. Just 5 years had passed since that night, but those 5 years in jail had aged her in ways that can't be measured simply in time. She stood before Maricopa County Superior Court Judge Jeffrey Fish. The judge called this case one of the court's most horrific cases. And how could it be anything else? 3 children, the youngest only 7 months old, killed by the person who should have been their greatest protector. Judge Fish handed down the sentence: 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Rachel Henry would spend every remaining day of her life behind bars. She would never again walk free in the world. She would never again feel the sun on her face without bars and walls surrounding her. She would never again hold a child, sing a lullaby, or have the opportunity to be the mother she might have been in different circumstances. So what do we do with a story like this? How do we process it? How do we file it away in our minds as we drift off to sleep? There's a temptation to see Rachel Henry as simply a monster, as evil incarnate. It would be easier that way, wouldn't it? If we could just label her as purely evil, as something other than human, then we could distance ourselves from her. We could reassure ourselves that we could never do such a thing. that our children are safe because we aren't monsters. But the truth is more complicated and more disturbing. Rachel Henry was a young woman who was drowning. She was struggling with addiction, with mental illness, with domestic violence, with poverty, with grief, with the overwhelming weight of trying to care for 3 small children when she couldn't even care for herself. She needed help, and she didn't get it, or couldn't accept it, or couldn't access it through all the barriers that stood in her way. This doesn't excuse what she did. Nothing excuses the murder of 3 innocent children. Those 3 little lives, Zane and Maria and Catalaya, deserve to grow up. They deserve to have childhoods, to learn to ride bikes and read books, to have first days of school and scraped knees and birthday parties. They deserve to become whoever they would have become. That was stolen from them by the person who should have protected them, and that is an unforgivable tragedy. But it's also true that Rachel Henry is a human being, a damaged, broken human being who did an unspeakable thing, but a human being nonetheless. And if we can't acknowledge the human factors that contributed to this tragedy, the systemic failures and the mental health crisis, and the addiction epidemic, and the domestic violence and the poverty, then we learn nothing from this. Then we're doomed to see it happen again and again, in other homes, in other cities, to other children. The state of Arizona recognized some of this complexity. That's why the death penalty was taken off the table. That's why, in the end, Rachel Henry will spend her life in prison rather than being executed. It's not mercy exactly. 3 consecutive life sentences is not a light punishment, but it's an acknowledgement that this case, as horrific as it is, exists in a context of human suffering and mental illness and all the ways that people can break. In that South Phoenix neighborhood, life goes on. Other children play in the streets where Zane and Maria and Catalaya will never play. Other families live their lives, tuck their children into bed at night, kiss their foreheads, whisper that they're loved. For Rachel Henry, in a prison cell somewhere in Arizona, there is only the weight of what she's done. She will wake up every morning for the rest of her life, knowing that she killed her children. She will carry that knowledge until the day she dies, alone in prison, decades from now. And for those who loved Zane and Maria and Catalaya, for their father, Pedro Rios, for their extended family, for everyone who knew them and loved them, there is only absence. There are only questions that can never fully be answered, grief that can never fully be processed, and the terrible knowledge that those 3 beautiful children are gone. This is the story of Rachel Henry and the 3 lives she took on a January evening in Phoenix. It's a story about mental illness and addiction, about the failures of our support systems, about domestic violence and poverty and all the ways that people can fall through the cracks. It's a story about how someone can love their children and still hurt them in the most unimaginable way. Most of all, it's a story about 3 children who deserved better, who deserved to live, who deserved a chance to grow up and become themselves. Zane Henry, Mireya Henry, Catalaya Rios. Remember their names. So if you're still awake, I'd like to know which of tonight's stories gave you chills the most. Was it the first story, the second, or the third? Meanwhile, let's move on to our 4th story. Story 4. Sometimes the most dangerous place you can be is exactly where you think you're safest. The place where family gathers, where children play, where ordinary Friday nights unfold with the hum of air conditioning and the blue glow of television screens. But on one July night in 2024, in a quiet neighborhood in American Fork, Utah, the concept of home became something else entirely. It became a trap. This is the story of Matthew Rastelli, a 42-year-old father who drove through the desert night believing he was going to save his marriage. He had no idea he was driving toward his own death. Matthew Rastelli, known to everyone as Matt, was the kind of man who measured his life in adventures. He wasn't content with the predictable rhythms of suburban existence. He needed the mountain trails beneath his feet, the rush of cold river water, the burn in his legs as he climbed higher into the wilderness. Those who knew him described him as someone with an adventurous spirit, someone who saw the natural world not as scenery, but as a cathedral. He was a father of 3 children, and more than anything, Matt wanted to share his love of the outdoors with them. He'd take them hiking, teach them to fish, show them how to read the landscape the way his own father had shown him. On the surface, his life looked full, active, purposeful, but beneath that surface, cracks had been forming for some time. By July 2024, Matt's 7-year marriage to his wife, Catherine, was fracturing. They argued often. She would later tell police that he yelled at her daily, that he struggled with substance misuse. He would tell his own mother something different, painting a picture of a relationship where he was trying to hold things together while his wife pulled away. The truth, as it often is in failing marriages, probably lay somewhere in the middle, in that gray space where both people are hurt and hurting, where love has curdled into resentment. What Matt didn't know was that Catherine had already left him in her mind. She'd left him long before she physically packed up 2 of their 3 children and drove from their home in California to her mother's house in Utah. That was early July 2024. She told Matt she needed space, a break, time to think. Matt, for his part, seemed willing to give her that time. But he also wanted her to come back. He offered to send her money to rent a car so she could drive home. He made plans. He tried to negotiate, and when she kept finding excuses, when she told him she couldn't drive back because of a sprained ankle, he made a decision. He would drive to Utah himself. He would pick up his wife and children and bring them home. It was the last decision he would ever make. While Matt was in California trying to figure out how to save his family, Catherine was in Utah, spinning an entirely different kind of web. She was 36 years old, a mother of 3. And by all accounts, she felt trapped. Not physically trapped, but legally, emotionally trapped by the weight of a marriage she no longer wanted. In May, 2 months before Matt's death, Catherine sent a text message to a friend. The words were flippant, the kind of dark humor people sometimes use when they're frustrated. "I'm trying to wait," she wrote. "I just might murder Matt today, though." At the time, it seemed like venting, hyperbole, the kind of thing people say but don't mean. Except Catherine did meet with a divorce attorney while she was in Utah, and that meeting didn't go the way she'd hoped. The attorney explained the complications of custody law when you've taken children across state lines without the other parent's permission. She explained the legal battles that would follow, the possibility that Matt could get custody, that the courts might not look favorably on a mother who'd fled with the kids. Catherine left that attorney's office feeling, in her own words, helpless. She didn't know what to do, so she did what many people do when they're in crisis. She turned to family. She turned to her mother. Tracy Grist was 59 years old in the summer of 2024. She lived in a nice neighborhood in American Fork, the kind of place with gated entries and security cameras, where neighbors knew each other's names. She was a mother who loved her daughter, but sometimes love can twist into something darker. Sometimes love can become enabling. And sometimes, when a mother sees her child in pain, she doesn't think about right or wrong. She thinks about fixing the problem. And Tracy Grist decided that Matt Rastelli was the problem. We know this because of what Tracy did in the weeks leading up to July 12. We know because of her internet search history, which tells its own chilling story. In June and July, Tracy searched for information about parental rights. She researched custody law. And then she searched for something else. She searched for information about Daniel Markel. If you're not familiar with the name, Daniel Markel was a Florida State University law professor who was murdered in 2014. His death was eventually revealed to be a conspiracy orchestrated by his ex-wife's family, specifically her mother and brother, who hired hitmen to kill him during a bitter custody dispute. The case became one of the most notorious family murder plots in recent American history. Tracy Grist was studying it like a blueprint. On July 12, 2024, just after 2 in the afternoon, Tracy made another internet search. She searched for "It's Happening" meme. You might know the one. It's a GIF from The Office. Michael Scott excitedly shouting, "It's happening." It's what people post when something they've been anticipating is finally about to occur. Tracy Grist knew something was about to occur because she'd helped plan it. The plan, when you lay it out piece by piece, had a certain cold efficiency to it. It wasn't sophisticated exactly, but it was thorough. It accounted for logistics, for timing, for optics. Step 1 was getting Matt to Utah. That part was easy. Matt loved his wife. He wanted his family back. So when she kept making excuses about why she couldn't return to California, when she told him about the sprained ankle that made driving impossible, Matt did exactly what they knew he would do. He decided to come to her. While Matt was preparing for the drive, Tracy suggested to her daughter that she should make the ankle injury look more convincing. "Can't drive with that ankle." Tracy texted, "I know we can wrap it and make it look swollen under the wrap." It was a small detail, but it speaks to the level of premeditation. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't a moment of rage. This was theater. Step 2 was tracking Matt's movements. Sometime in June, someone, they never determined exactly who, placed an Apple AirTag in Matt's truck. These small devices are designed to help you find lost items, but they can also be used to track someone without their knowledge. Throughout late June and early July, the family was monitoring Matt's location. They knew where he was at all times. On July 12th, Matt told Catherine he was leaving California. He was driving through the night to come get her. He gave her his estimated arrival time. She in turn gave him everything he needed to find the house. The gate code to the neighborhood, the exact address, even a photo of the house so he'd know which one it was. Matt was worried about practical things. His truck had an oil leak. Catherine told him she'd put cardboard down in the driveway so he wouldn't stain the concrete. He was worried the truck might not restart if he turned it off. He told her he'd leave it running while they loaded up. It would only take 15 minutes. They talked about whether he'd come inside. Matt seemed hesitant at first. Then Catherine asked again, more insistent this time. Are you gonna come inside? Okay, he said. The front door is always unlocked. Okay? She was making sure he'd walk through that door, because waiting inside in the entryway near the stairs was Catherine's brother. Kevin Ellis was 33 years old. He lived with his mother, Tracy Grist, in the American Fork House. His history was complicated. He had prior charges, issues with drugs and domestic violence. But his mother and sister described him as gentle. So gentle, Tracy would later tell authorities when trying to explain what happened. On the morning of July 12th, Kevin Ellis armed himself with a handgun. His mother was there. His sister was upstairs with her children, and they all waited. Catherine posted something to her social media group that morning. I have to do big girl things this morning, she wrote. Wish me luck. The hours crawled by. Matt was driving through Nevada, then into Utah. The family was tracking his progress through the AirTag in his truck. They watched him get closer, closer. The tension in that house must have been unbearable. Finally, at 10:08 as 9:06 p.m., Matt's truck pulled into the driveway. The engine was running. The headlights cut across the garage door. Somewhere upstairs, Catherine was with her children, waiting for the sound of gunfire. Matt Rastelli walked through the unlocked front door. He was probably tired from the long drive, probably anxious about seeing his wife, about navigating this conversation, about getting his family back into the truck and starting the long drive home. He made it just inside the entryway, near the stairs. That's where Kevin Ellis was waiting. What happened next was brutally quick. A neighbor sitting in their own home heard the gunshots. They looked at the clock, 10:07 p.m. 1 minute after Matt arrived, they immediately called Catherine's family. No one answered. At 10:09 p.m., the neighbor called 911. Inside the house, Matt Rastelli had been shot multiple times. The medical examiner would later determine he'd been hit 6, possibly 7 times. 8 shell casings were found at the scene. Kevin Ellis had unloaded nearly an entire magazine into his brother-in-law. Matt collapsed near the stairs. Blood pooled on the floor. He was 42 years old. His children were upstairs. His truck was still running in the driveway. For the next several minutes, there was activity in that house. People moving, talking, making decisions. Tracy Grist didn't call 911 immediately. She waited. 6 minutes passed between the time Matt was shot and the time Tracy picked up the phone. 6 minutes is a long time when someone is dying, but it's just enough time to stage a scene. When police arrived at the house on Quell Meadow Drive, they found what appeared to be a straightforward case of self-defense. A man had shown up at his estranged wife's family home, armed with a knife, and her brother had shot him to protect the family. Tracy Grist told them that Matt had been agitated, that he'd surprised them, that he'd had a knife. Kevin Ellis said he'd shot Matt in self-defense, that he'd had no choice. And there on the floor, lying next to Matt's body, was indeed a knife. It was in his right hand, gripped in his dead fingers. The story should have held up, but American Fork Police Detective Jeremy Norden noticed something immediately. The knife blade was facing inward, toward Matt's palm. That's not how you hold a weapon. That's not how you threaten someone. When you brandish a knife, the blade faces out, away from your body, toward your target. This knife looked like it had been placed in Matt's hand after he was already dead. Detective Norden made another note. Matt Rastelli was left-handed. The knife was in his right hand. The police took Kevin Ellis into custody that night. They also asked Catherine and Tracy to come to the station for questioning. And they seized everyone's phones. In modern crime investigations, phones are often more revealing than witnesses. They don't forget. They don't lie. They store everything. Every text message, every search, every location ping. And the phones belonging to Catherine Rastelli and Tracy Grist told a very different story than the one they'd given police. Detectives discovered the texts between mother and daughter, the ones about faking the sprained ankle. They found the messages about the AirTag tracking Matt's location. They found Tracy's internet searches about the Daniel Markle case, about custody law, about parental rights. They found that on July 12th, minutes before Matt arrived, the family was texting about his location. They were watching him approach in real time. And then there was the knife itself. It didn't belong to Matt. Police traced it back to a monthly subscription box, one of those tactical gift services. The subscription had belonged to a friend of Tracy's whose husband had recently died. Tracy had visited the friend in April, helping her manage affairs after the death. The husband had been subscribed to the box, and Tracy had helped cancel it, but not before taking one of the knives. It was a knife meant to look like it belonged to Matt, something he might have carried, but he hadn't carried it. The picture that emerged was methodical, premeditated, a family conspiracy to murder a man and make it look like self-defense. The day after Matt's death, Catherine got on a video call with some of her online friends. These were women she'd been confiding in, women who knew about her marital problems. She told them Matt was dead, and then she did something that shocked them. She showed them the blood on the floor where he'd been shot. When her friends expressed sympathy, offered condolences, Catherine told them it was okay. She was happy, she said. Then she went on a date. That detail that she went on a date the day after her husband was murdered, in her mother's house while her children were upstairs, tells you something about Catherine Rastelli's state of mind. Whether it was dissociation, relief, or something colder, we may never fully know. What we do know is that by October 29, 2024, police had built their case. They arrested all three family members. Tracy Grist, the matriarch, Kevin Ellis, the shooter, and Catherine Rastelli, the wife who had lured her husband to his death. The charges were murder, conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and domestic violence in the presence of a child. The last charge was particularly tragic. Matt and Catherine's children had been upstairs during the shooting. They heard the gunshots that killed their father. They were witnesses, traumatized by a violence orchestrated by their own family. Kevin Ellis initially maintained his self-defense claim, but as the evidence mounted, as the prosecution laid out the timeline, the tracking, the staged knife, the premeditation, his defense began to crumble. Catherine Rastelli was the first to break. In July 2025, she accepted a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to reduced counts of murder and conspiracy to commit murder, both second-degree felonies, and felony discharge of a firearm, a first-degree felony. In exchange, other charges were dismissed, and she agreed to testify against her mother and brother. On September 9, 2025, Catherine stood before Judge David Griffin in a Provo courtroom for sentencing. Matt's mother, Diane Rastelli, was there. She had last spoken to her son just 2 hours before he died. He'd called her from the road, checking in, telling her he was almost there. She'd wished him luck with Catherine, hoped they could work things out. Now she faced the woman who had helped orchestrate her son's murder. Diane read a victim impact statement. She talked about Matt's love for his children, his passion for the outdoors, the hole his death had left in their family. She talked about the grandchildren who would grow up without their father. Judge Griffin was direct in his remarks to Catherine. Your selfish actions show that you didn't love your children at all, he said. You made them victims. He sentenced her to the maximum punishments allowed under her plea agreement. 1 to 15 years for murder. 1 to 15 years for conspiracy to commit murder. 5 years to life for felony discharge of a firearm. The sentences would run consecutively, meaning she would serve them one after another, not at the same time. Effectively, Catherine Rastelli was sentenced to between 7 years and life in prison. Judge Griffin also issued a no-contact order protecting her children. She would not be allowed to reach out to them in any way. The courtroom was quiet as Catherine was led away. Tracy Grist and Kevin Ellis pleaded not guilty. Their trials were scheduled for January 2026. As of now, they remain in Utah County Jail without bail, waiting for their day in court. Catherine is expected to testify against them, to detail the planning, the conspiracy, the family meetings where they discussed how to kill Matt and make it look justified. It's a betrayal on top of betrayal. A mother and brother waiting for trial. A sister and daughter who will take the stand against them. The children. All three of them were placed in the custody of the Division of Child and Family Services. They lost their father to violence. They lost their mother to prison. They lost their grandmother and uncle to criminal conspiracy. In one night, their entire family structure was obliterated. As with any crime like this, we're left with questions. Questions that don't have satisfying answers. Why didn't Catherine just file for divorce? Yes, there would have been custody complications because she'd taken the children across state lines. Yes, it would have been difficult and expensive and emotionally draining. But people navigate difficult divorces every day. They hire attorneys. They go to mediation. They fight in family court. Why murder? Some have speculated that Catherine feared losing custody entirely, that she couldn't bear the thought of sharing her children with Matt, or worse, losing them to him. Others have suggested financial motives, though that hasn't been confirmed publicly. The truth might be simpler and more disturbing. Sometimes people in crisis make catastrophically bad decisions. And sometimes when you surround yourself with people who enable your worst impulses rather than challenge them, those bad decisions become lethal. Tracy Grist could have talked her daughter down. She could have helped her find a good attorney, supported her through a divorce, reminded her that difficulty is not the same as impossibility. Instead, she researched murder conspiracies and helped her daughter plan one. Kevin Ellis could have refused. He could have walked away. He could have told his sister and mother that he wouldn't be part of this. Instead, he waited in that entryway with a loaded gun. And Catherine could have been honest with Matt. She could have told him the marriage was over. She could have faced the legal consequences of taking the children to Utah. She could have fought for custody through the proper channels. Instead, she sent him the gate code and told him the front door would be unlocked. In all of this, in the conspiracy and the trial and the sentencing, it's easy to lose sight of the actual victim. Matthew Restelli wasn't a perfect man. His marriage was troubled. He had his flaws, as we all do, but he didn't deserve to die. He drove through the night because he loved his wife and wanted his family back. He was willing to drive 12 hours through the desert to pick them up, to give them another chance, to try to fix what was broken. He worried about his oil leak staining the driveway. He planned to leave his truck running so it wouldn't fail to restart. These are the thoughts of a man focused on logistics, on being considerate, on making things easier for everyone else. Matt's obituary described him as someone with a deep love for the outdoors and a profound appreciation for the natural world. Talked about his commitment to his family, to giving them shared experiences of adventure. He was a father who took his kids hiking, a man who found peace in mountains and rivers. Someone who, despite his struggles, kept showing up, kept trying, kept loving the people who ultimately betrayed him. On July 12, 2024, Matt Restelli pulled into a driveway in American Fork, Utah, believing he was going to reconcile with his wife. He had no weapon. He was left-handed, but they would place a knife in his right hand after he was already dead. He was shot 7 times in an entryway, his truck still running outside, his children still awake upstairs. He was 42 years old. As I tell you this story in the quiet darkness, as you drift towards sleep, Tracy Grist and Kevin Ellis are sitting in separate cells in the Utah County Jail. They're waiting for their trials, waiting to hear whether a jury will believe their self-defense claim, or see through it the way the police did. Catherine Restelli is in prison, beginning a sentence that could last the rest of her life. She'll never see her children grow up. She'll never attend their graduations, their weddings, never meet her grandchildren. She traded all of that for one night of violence that she thought would set her free. And somewhere, 3 children are trying to make sense of a world where their father is dead, and their mother is in prison, and their grandmother and uncle are on trial for murder. They're trying to process a trauma that most adults couldn't handle, let alone children. This is what a murder conspiracy looks like in real life. Not a thriller, not a dramatic courtroom scene with twist endings. Just broken families and dead fathers and children who will carry this weight forever. So the case isn't over yet. The trials of Tracy Grist and Kevin Ellis will likely happen in early 2026, and we'll learn more details then. We'll hear Catherine testify. We'll see what evidence the prosecution presents. We'll find out if a jury believes that Kevin Ellis shot Matt Rastelli in self-defense, or if they see the truth that this was a planned execution with the family pulling the trigger. But regardless of the verdicts, one truth remains unchangeable. On a summer night in Utah, a man drove through the darkness to save his marriage and walked into a trap set by the people he should have been able to trust. And he never walked out. That's the story of Matthew Rastelli. A cautionary tale about family loyalty twisted into something monstrous. About the terrible things people do when they feel cornered. About the difference between difficulty and impossibility. And what happens when you choose violence instead of patience. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight we're diving into a case that's both tragic and intricate. A story about secrets, desperation, and the lengths one man went to protect his reputation. This is the story of Holly Williams and William Lanway, two people whose lives ended on a quiet Nashville construction road in March of 2020. This case isn't just about what happened in those final moments. It's about the web of lies that led there, the electronic trails that couldn't be erased, and the investigators who refused to let this become just another unsolved crime. It was March 13th, 2020, Good Friday. The world was just beginning to understand the magnitude of the COVID-19 pandemic. Cities were shutting down, streets were empty, but in West Nashville, on a quiet construction road near a residential area, a construction worker was about to make a discovery that would haunt him. He was doing his routine work that morning when he noticed something unusual. A white Acura sedan, trashed against a tree. The front end was crumpled, but not devastated. It looked almost staged, like someone had gently nudged it there rather than crashed at high speed. The construction worker approached cautiously, and that's when he saw them. Two bodies, one in the front passenger seat, one in the back. The police arrived within minutes of the 911 call. Metro Nashville Police Detective Patrick Cuthbertson was among the first investigators on scene, and he immediately knew this wasn't a typical car accident. This was like a scene out of a movie, he would later say. Both victims had been shot multiple times. There was no sign of a struggle inside the vehicle, no bullet casings anywhere nearby, and perhaps most tellingly, no cell phone. The victims were soon identified. In the passenger seat was William Lanway, 36 years old, known to friends as Bill. He was a mechanic, a man who worked with his hands and knew his way around engines and tools. In the back seat, slumped over, was Holly Williams. She was 33, an esthetician by day who worked at a local salon, helping people feel beautiful and confident. But as investigators would soon discover, Holly had another life, a secret life that very few people knew about. Holly Williams wasn't just Holly Williams. To some, she was someone else entirely. In the evenings, Holly worked as an escort under the name Layla Love. It was a part of her life she kept carefully compartmentalized, separated from her day job, separated from most of her friendships. In her online profiles, Layla Love was described as sophisticated, charming, available for companionship. It was how Holly supplemented her income, and she was careful about it, screening clients, maintaining boundaries. Her relationship with William Lanway was complicated. Friends who knew them both told investigators that it was toxic, marked by arguments and instability. Holly had even installed security cameras around her apartment because of domestic disputes with Bill. She wanted evidence if things ever escalated. She wanted to feel safe. Those cameras were recording on March 12, 2020, and they would become the key to everything. Detective David Willover and his team pulled the security footage from Holly's apartment building. They watched the days leading up to the murders carefully, scanning for anything unusual. And they found it. On multiple occasions in early March, the cameras captured something deeply unsettling. Men appearing at Holly's door. Not just one man. Multiple men. And they weren't acting like normal visitors. They were obscuring their faces, wearing hats and keeping their heads down, trying to avoid identification. It was deliberate, calculated. Inside the apartment, the interior cameras showed Holly pacing nervously. At one point, she reinforced her door, bracing it with furniture, clearly terrified that whoever was outside might try to force their way in. Her body language said everything. She knew she was in danger. But who were these men? And what did they want? With no immediate way to identify the men from the footage, detectives turned to the victim's phone records. This is where the case took its first major turn. Phone records are like breadcrumbs in the digital age. Every call, every text, every contact leaves a trace. And in this case, those traces were everywhere. Investigators noticed something curious. Both Holly Williams and William Lanway had been in contact with the same unknown number. It was a VoIP number, a voice-over IP phone service, the kind that masks the caller's actual phone number and location. These services are often used by people who want privacy, sometimes for legitimate reasons, sometimes for less savory ones. VoIP numbers are tricky, but they're not untraceable. While they hide the caller's traditional phone number, they still leave behind a trail of IP addresses, digital fingerprints that can be tracked back to computers and locations. Detective Willover and his team started digging. They followed the IP addresses associated with that VoIP number, tracing them through servers and networks. It took time, patience, and expertise, but eventually they got a hit. The number belonged to a man named Adam Carey. Adam Carey was 30 years old, living in Richlands, North Carolina. But this wasn't just some random guy. Carey was a former United States Marine with special operations training. He had worked in private security after leaving the military. The kind of work that requires discretion, physical capability, and a certain comfort with danger. He also had a criminal record. Detectives pulled Carey's driver's license photo and compared it to the footage from Holly's security cameras. It was a match. One of the men who had been stalking Holly's apartment, trying to make contact with her in those days before the murders, was Adam Carey. But Carey didn't live in Nashville. He had no obvious connection to Holly or Bill. Why was a former Marine from North Carolina showing up at the apartment of a Nashville esthetician? The answer, investigators were beginning to realize, was that Carey wasn't working alone. He was working for someone. In early 2021, nearly a year after the murders, investigators caught another break. They discovered a document that would blow the case wide open. It was called the Tennessee Sitrep. In military terminology, Sitrep is short for Situation Report, a detailed account of operations on the ground, including objectives, resources, and personnel. Someone had created a situation report for an operation in Tennessee, and that someone was a man named Brian Brockway. Brian Brockway, like Adam Carey, was a former Marine. He also worked in private security, specializing in what some might call the darker side of that industry: surveillance, intelligence gathering, and muscle for hire. The Tennessee Sitrep outlined a plan: locate Holly Williams and William Lanway, monitor their movements, prepare for further action. It illustrated there were people who were getting paid to be in Nashville to look for Holly and William. Assistant U.S. Attorney Robert McGuire later explained, "This wasn't random violence. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a coordinated operation, planned and executed by professionals." But who was paying them? The money trail led investigators to another name: Gilad Peled, also known as Gil Peled. Peled was an Israeli national, a former member of the Israeli Defense Forces, and the owner of a private security company called Speartip Security. He was the kind of person who knew how to make problems disappear quietly. Into Peled, it turned out, had recently been hired by a client in Austin, Texas. A wealthy client. A client with a very big problem. Eric Charles Mond didn't look like a murderer. He looked like success. In Austin, Texas, the Mond family was well known, even prominent. They owned Mond Toyota, one of the largest car dealerships in the city. Eric was a partner in the business, living a life of wealth and comfort with his wife and children. He had the kind of resume that impressed people at cocktail parties. A successful businessman, a family man, a pillar of the Austin community. But Eric Mond had a secret. In early February 2020, Mond traveled to Nashville to visit his son. While he was there, he hired an escort. He didn't know her real name. To him, she was just Layla Love, a beautiful woman who provided companionship for a few hours. They spent time together, and then Eric returned home to Austin. Back to his family, back to his normal life. He thought that was the end of it. A brief indiscretion in another city, something that would stay buried in the past. But on March 1st, 2020, Eric Mond received a text message. An anonymous text. And the message was chilling. Pay $25,000, or the sender would expose everything. They would tell his wife. They would tell his business partners. They would destroy his carefully constructed life. Eric panicked. He couldn't let this information come out. His marriage, his reputation, his standing in the Austin community. All of it would crumble if anyone learned he had hired an escort. He needed help. He needed someone who could make this problem go away quietly. So he called Jill Pillard. Pillard had been doing some consulting work for Mon Toyota, helping the dealership deal with a homeless encampment on their property. It was small-time work, but it established a relationship. When Mon reached out in desperation, Pillard agreed to help. Find out who sent that text, Mon told him. Find out who this Layla Love really is. Pillard got to work. He reached out to Brian Brockway's brother, Chad Brockway, who ran his own security firm. Pillard spun a story. He claimed he was working for a Nashville family whose daughter might have been sex trafficked. They needed help tracking her down. Chad believed him and did the research. Within days, they had answers. Layla Love was Holly Williams, a 33-year-old woman living in Nashville. And the person behind the extortion, that was William Lanway, Holly's on-again, off-again boyfriend. Pell passed this information back to Mon, but he also passed it to Brian Brockway, the other Brockway brother, the one who didn't ask as many questions. With Holly's identity confirmed, Brian Brockway hired a small team. Adam Carey, the former Marine, was the primary muscle. 2 other men were brought in as well, operatives with security backgrounds who could help with surveillance and intimidation. Their initial assignment seemed clear. Make contact with Holly, scare her, convince her, and Lamway to back off the extortion. That's why they showed up at Holly's apartment in early March. The security cameras captured them knocking on her door, trying to make contact. But Holly didn't answer. She was terrified, bracing the door from the inside, waiting for them to leave. The men came back multiple times, but Holly never opened the door. Then on March 11th, 2020, everything changed. That day, William Lanway made a phone call. He called Eric Mon's home in Austin. Eric was there with his family when the phone rang. He answered it, and Lanway was on the other end. Aggressive, demanding, making threats. Eric's wife was right there in the house. She could have picked up an extension. She could have heard everything. Eric was terrified. The extortion was escalating. It wasn't just a text anymore. These people knew where he lived. They had his home number. His carefully compartmentalized secret life was about to explode into his real life. He contacted Peled immediately. Meanwhile, in Nashville, Brian Brockway had already arrived in the city. He met up with Adam Carey. The 2 other operatives, the ones who had been helping with surveillance, were preparing to leave town. They believed the job was essentially done, just some light intimidation work. But on March 11th, Brockway made Carey an offer. According to investigators, Brockway told Peled that he and Carey could murder both Lanway and Williams for $60,000 each. Total price $20,000. Peled relayed the offer to Mons. And according to Peled's later testimony, Eric Mond approved the plan. The 2 operatives who had been helping with surveillance left Nashville that day. They had no idea what was about to happen. To them, it was just a surveillance job that was wrapping up. But for Brockway and Carey, the real work was just beginning. The morning of March 12th, 2020 seemed like an ordinary day for Holly Williams. She woke up in her apartment. Bill Lanway was there with her. Whatever their relationship problems had been, they were together that morning. Holly's doorway security camera was recording, as it always did. At around 11:30 in the morning, the camera captured Holly and Bill walking out of the apartment. They were heading to his car. Probably going to run some errands, maybe grab lunch. They never made it. What happened next was captured on audio, though not on video. The security camera picked up the sounds. Footsteps, a confrontation, shouting, and then gunshots. Multiple gunshots. A man's voice, screaming. A woman's voice, screaming. More gunshot, then silence. According to investigators, Brockway and Carey ambushed the couple in the parking lot. They shot William Lanway first, multiple times. He fell where he stood. Then they turned their weapons on Holly. She screamed. She tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. After both victims were shot, Brockway and Carey moved quickly. They couldn't leave the bodies in the parking lot where someone might see them. They loaded both bodies into the white Acura Bill's body in the front passenger seat. Holly's in the back. Then they drove. They drove the car to a secluded construction area in West Nashville. a place where the vehicle wouldn't be immediately discovered. They positioned the car against a tree, making it look like an accident. They collected the bullet casings. They took the victim's cell phones. And then they left. Within hours, Eric Mond wired $150,000 to Gil Peld's account. The payment was made on March 12, 2020, the same day of the murders. The bodies were discovered the next morning, March 13th. But by then, the killers were long gone. For months, investigators worked the case. They analyzed the security footage, pulled phone records, traced financial transactions. The FBI joined the investigation in June 2020 because the case crossed state lines. Suspects in North Carolina, Texas, and possibly Israel. But the big break came in late 2020, when one of the two operatives, the men who had initially helped with surveillance but left Nashville before the murders, agreed to cooperate with law enforcement. He was horrified when he learned what had happened after he left. He agreed to wear a recording device and have conversations with both Adam Carey and Brian Brockway. During these recorded conversations, he posed as someone interested in hiring them for a made-up hit job. He asked questions, trying to get them to talk about their methods, their experience. And Brockway, confident and unguarded, revealed details that only someone involved in the Nashville murders would know. It was enough. On December 10, 2021, nearly 2 years after the murders, the FBI executed coordinated raids. Adam Carey was arrested in North Carolina. Brian Brockway was arrested wherever he was living. Jill Peled was taken into custody, but they still needed Eric Mond. Investigators asked Peled to make one more call. Peled, now cooperating with authorities, called Mond and told him that one of the operatives was demanding more money, threatening to go public if he wasn't paid. The call was recorded, and during that conversation, Mond made several statements that investigators believe showed he had knowledge of the murders and had been part of the conspiracy. The moment the call ended, FBI agents moved in. Eric Mond was arrested at his home in Austin. All 4 men were charged in federal court. Eric Mond, Jill Peled, Brian Brockway, and Adam Carey. The charges included conspiracy to commit murder for hire, kidnapping resulting in death, and firearms charges. Gil Peled, facing overwhelming evidence and a potential life sentence, decided to cooperate. He pleaded guilty and agreed to testify against the others. His testimony would be crucial. The trial began in 2023 and lasted 14 days. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence. Financial records showing Mond had wired $150,000 to Peled on the day of the murders, and ultimately paid more than $750,000 total for the operation. Phone records showing constant communication between all the conspirators. Security camera footage, audio recordings, the testimony of the undercover operative who had helped expose Brockway. And most devastatingly, they had Jill Peled on the stand, walking the jury through every step of the conspiracy. How Mond hired him to solve a problem. How that problem escalated from finding information to threatening violence to actual murder. How the money flowed from Mond's accounts to Peled's to the killers. The defense argued that Mond had only wanted information, that he never explicitly approved of murder, that he was a victim of Peled's manipulation. But the jury didn't buy it. After 7 hours of deliberation on November 17, 2023, they returned their verdict. Adam Carey, guilty of murder for hire resulting in death, conspiracy to commit kidnapping and kidnapping resulting in death. Brian Brockway, guilty of murder for hire resulting in death, conspiracy to commit kidnapping and kidnapping resulting in death. Eric Mond, guilty of conspiracy to commit murder for hire, not guilty of the kidnapping charges, but guilty of the core conspiracy. All 3 men faced mandatory life sentences. The families of Holly Williams and William Lanway sat in that courtroom and heard those verdicts. There was relief. Certainly, justice in the legal sense had been served. But as Detective Patrick Cuthbertson said afterward, there was no real victory here. The families didn't deserve this tragedy, and this trauma for both of their loved ones, being killed the way they were killed. Holly Williams was 33 years old. She was trying to make a living in whatever way she could. She was someone's daughter, someone's friend. Her life had complications and struggles, but she didn't deserve to die in a parking lot, murdered by men she'd never met, ordered killed by a man whose name she probably never even knew. William Lanway was 36. Yes, he had tried to extort money from Eric Mond. It was wrong. It was criminal. But the punishment for extortion isn't death. It's not being ambushed and shot in front of your girlfriend. Eric Mond wanted to protect his reputation, his marriage, his standing in the community. He was willing to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to make a problem disappear. And when intimidation didn't work, when the problem persisted, he was willing to pay even more to make it disappear permanently. 2 people died because a wealthy man valued his secrets more than their lives. The case revealed the dark underbelly of private security firms, the ease with which violence can be outsourced for money, and the devastating consequences when privilege meets desperation. As of now, appeals are pending. Eric Mond's attorneys maintain his innocence. But the evidence, the testimony, the jury's verdict, they all tell the same story. A story about choices, about consequences, about 2 people who went out to their car one March morning and never came home. And that's the story of Holly Williams and William Lanway. A case that seemed random at first, like a tragic crime scene out of a movie. But underneath was a conspiracy that stretched across state lines, involved former military operatives, and was orchestrated by a man who thought money could solve any problem. Sometimes in true crime we search for lessons or meaning in tragedy. Maybe the lesson here is simple. Secrets have weight. And when we try to bury them at any cost, the cost can become unimaginable. Tonight, remember, Holly and Bill were real people whose lives mattered, whose stories deserve to be told with dignity and truth. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.